I wasn't quite sure what people were going to be talking about today, so I did this in lack of knowledge of what people had said. But what I'm planning to talk about is evidence and how it's been applied to some of our substances over time. I'm not going to be talking about food because I don't know so much about that. I'm going to be talking particularly about tobacco and also what are now termed illicit drugs, and also to try and relate that to our theme, which is that of expertise. And I'm interested in how different constellations of interests and their relationships to structures of government and state kind of help focus and maintain the boundaries between substances that we're talking about. Now, because I work on very recent times, not 5th century BC, the background for me is the recent rise of evidence as significant in health and medicine and policy making. And I would see that here as, if we're talking about the UK, as a kind of twin-track legacy of the ideas of social medicine in the interwar period and the 1940s. One track leading to our contemporary ideas about public health and health promotion, but the other track leading to a focus on evidence, on health services research, on epidemiology, on new styles of primarily quantitative research and evidence in the post-war period. And that, I think, leads us straight away to one of our substances, a substance, which is smoking, and there the rise of evidence as emblematic, I think, of some of the new directions in using evidence in maintaining boundaries. And here, of course, I'm referring to the Dole Hill research in the immediate post-war period about the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. And we see through that a kind of rise of a new style of research, of chronic disease epidemiology, of a focus on risk, which Matthew was talking about earlier on, and also a narrowing, in a sense, through that research on a particular, it's a bit like the peanuts of the 1950s, smoking and tobacco and the cigarette as something which is the risky substance, rather than the much more amorphous ideas about air pollution and cancer, which were floating about at the same time. But of course, here we come to the transfer to policy. What causes evidence to link into policy? And there wasn't an immediate transfer to policy, as we know, in the smoking case, and lots of intervening variables, which is what I want us to kind of focus on. Not just the issue of commercial interests, but also the issue of science, and what did the science mean? What do different forms of science mean in these areas? So that's one thing to think about. If we turn to drugs, illicit drugs, a very different evidence trajectory, I think, in the 20th century. In the 1920s, when the Rolleston Committee on Morphine and Heroin Addiction, which set the trend of British drug policy for the next 40 years, when that took evidence, it was the clinical case study which was important. And that remained so, but a crucial change, I think, came in the 1970s with the randomised controlled trial carried out by Richard Hartnell and Martin Mitchison of injectable heroin versus oral methadone. I think this is a very significant moment for evidence in the drugs field, not least that evidence was used to justify a change which was already taking place in the drugs field, away from heroin and towards methadone. So I think here there's another point to note, that evidence doesn't exist as something as value-free or in isolation. Evidence is the outcome of interests, and interests in policy making, and in this case it was the role of medical professionals, and in particular psychiatrists, which were very important and influential. And then we go on to, we can trace this through in the drugs field into from the 1980s right up to the present day, where drugs becomes a kind of evidence battleground. One can look at HIV/AIDS and needle exchange research in the 1980s, where again research was used very carefully to justify a harm reduction approach, which interests in the field, researchers and people involved in running services and so on, in fact already wanted. Again, with treatment effectiveness and the rise of methadone in the 1990s, where political interests around treatment, interesting parallels with what's going on in the present, in a sense, researchers use that political interest to conduct research into treatment, but also to turn what the politicians wanted on its head, and it in fact led to an expansion of prescription of methadone. And more recently moves to reinstate heroin prescription, which again have been justified by evidence by the randomised controlled trial, and this has been an international enterprise with RCTs going on across Europe and also in North America. So I think I'm probably coming to the end of my 10 minutes. So I could make the same points over and over again in relation to other substances. I haven't even mentioned alcohol, let alone food. But I think the points I want to make are very much that the evidence-based model, which has come to prominence in the post-war period, implies a kind of rational model of understanding substances. But what we don't see behind that are the conflicting interests and the different constellations and groupings of expertise which lie behind these substances, which feed into different groupings, which feed into sometimes into different government departments, the Home Office for Drugs, for example, the Department of Health for tobacco, and the way in which those serve to kind of reinforce to some degree and also to maintain certain styles of boundary. Interestingly, and this is my last point, in recent times scientists have tried to break down some of those boundaries, and most of you will know the name of David Nutt, formerly of the ACMD, but he and Colin Blakemore of the MRC and other scientists produced a piece in The Lancet about 3 years ago talking about let's try and bring the substances all together, let's try and assess them all, you know, tobacco, alcohol, illicit drugs, prescribed drugs, on the basis of a kind of rational assessment of the harms that they cause. Now that again, as a historian, I'm very interested in that development. I wouldn't see it as totally rational. I would see it again as an outgrowth of a particular constellation of interests in the field. In this case, the growing role of psychopharmacology. So my final message is, I think, let's take evidence with a pinch of salt, whether that's another substance we ought to be looking at when we're talking about substances and boundaries.
Thanks very much.